white and black audiences, and every other color imaginable.
Dear white people.
I just want to say that I find your show offensive.
Having a black vibrator does not count as an interracial relationship.
And highly divisive.
When you ask someone who looks ethnically different,
what are you?
The answer is usually a person about to slap the shit out of you.
We need to come together at times like this.
When are you gonna wake up to your white privilege, man?
I'm black.
Sorry, brother. Thanks for calling.
Miss White. Her rhetoric makes this campus look like a powder keg of racial unrest, like a state school.
How did we get here? Who hurt you?
Well, 200 years.
Slavery, got it right. Sorry I asked. With me as your lifeline, we will have unprecedented access to the administration.
We should vote for you because your father's the dean. The girls and I are going to the Midsummer's Night Dream Party. That thing where the girls wander around outside waiting for a senior to date rape them? For a senior to kiss them. You're confusing it with the Taming of the Shrew Party.
A bunch of white kids dressing up like us?
In 2017, I can't believe something like this can happen.
It's almost like you and I attend two separate schools.
Have to unpack my best friend having a secret bae.
Secret or white?
We met in the comments section of that Medium article you wrote. Don't fall in love with your oppressor.
That one got so many likes.
You're not just a black man, you're a gay black man.
I'm sorry.
Gay? I'm sorry. Are you straight?
Oddly specific.
We're going to bring together every group on this campus and demand real justice.
Guys, you know what this is? This is racism.
Yeah, I thought President Obama fixed all that.
I know.
This is what happens when a country refuses to address its history with slavery.
We need to do here what they did in Germany.
What?
I meant the educating kids about the nation's horrible past part, not the concentration camp part.
Oh, okay, because I was about to say.
Can we start by telling us a little bit more about yourselves and kind of what your experience has been?
Hi, I'm Logan Browning. I have been acting for more than half my life at this point. So 10 years, I'm 20, just kidding. I started acting, like Francis said, when I was 14, and it's been an amazing journey. I've gotten to play really amazing characters with the guidance of my representation, who has always wanted me to play roles that really pushed me and pushed the envelope. And so that's how I ended up on a really cool show called Dear White People. And through the journey of being on that show, I've learned so much about race, so much about myself, my own identity, which I did not expect jumping onto that show. You know, didn't really think I was going to be facing light skin privilege when I signed that first contract. And it's been a really amazing journey. And yeah, now I'm moving on to directing, which is really awesome. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. We're happy to have you.
Yeah. I'm so happy Logan's here. All right. My name is Aubrielle, and in addition to, well, I guess you wanted to know how I even started doing all these random things.
You're like computer science, music, acting, PhD from Harvard.
My life really doesn't make sense.
How do those things kind of, relate to each other?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, the way I make sense of it is that as somebody who's biracial and has a white mom, I have always been thought about racial identity. It's something that I couldn't escape. And I really found solace in the arts because that was a place where I could start to unpack a lot of those things in the same way that Logan said her role did that for her. Making music really did that for me. But the music industry is trash. Talk about biases. It's full of them. And so I started actually going into tech, and I co-founded a startup. And I, like many people in tech, had this kind of utopian idea of like technology is just going to fix this problem. It's going to be really hard, but we're going to be able to fix this problem. That's my baby, by the way. And I found that there's a lot of opportunity, but there are also many pitfalls in trying to fix large structural inequities using technology. And so that's what drove me to go to grad school, because I really wanted to do research around that, understand the interplay between tech and identity and oppression.
Nice. Yeah. So we've called this talk Dear Algorithmic Bias, right? And so we really want to talk about some of these biases that have come up, with the democratization of media overall. Can you explain to people what that is and why it really even matters?
Yeah. So algorithmic bias, most of you probably already know what this is, but it's really just these kind of real-world biases that get baked into technology in various ways. Whether that's through the data that we're training models on, the actual models themselves and what we set as objectives, and more importantly, what we don't set as objectives. And then the fact that they have consequences out in the real world that are usually unintended. So for example, in criminal justice, there are a lot of these things, right? So facial recognition technology, because it's built on mostly white male faces in their corpora, we know that cameras out on the street, cameras that law enforcement are using, are actually misidentifying people of color and women of color specifically. So that's just an example of kind of a real world implication of this, and I'm sure we'll go into others. Yeah.
Sure. We'll get into it.
Yeah.
And so, Logan, when we kind of talk about the democratization of media and the ability for creatives to, really have multiple platforms, right? You've been in, network and cable television. You're on Netflix. You've been on feature films. How has this rise of, all these platforms impacted you as a creative?
Well, I think first and foremost, engagement. You get user feedback immediately. And with a platform like Netflix, where you're not waiting week to week to see the content, it's all streamed immediately. You can go onto any platform and hear what people think. Yeah. And when I say people, I literally mean everyone. I mean, Netflix is in every country but 2, I'm pretty sure. And so for me, I kind of get to see a pool of who is watching it, who is enjoying it, who wants, who likes certain characters, certain storylines. And I will say it does affect our creatives when it comes to, the future seasons, because they care about, what the viewers of the show feel. And it's funny because me personally, I kind of am somewhere in the middle, right? Because you're getting that user feedback, but also that's not everyone who is watching the show. Right. So I'm always like, okay, there could be a group of people. It's like a Yelp review. Like, people aren't always leaving the best Yelp reviews. They're leaving like the worst ones. Yeah. So you may have a certain audience who is loving content, but they're not necessarily going and talking about it. And so you may be changing things that they saw themselves in or really liked. And so I think that has made it, that's really changed the game. Whereas before, you just put out content, and the only way you'd really know if people liked it or not was like who was turning out to the theaters.
Right. I think that's actually interesting. We kind of talk about that bias, right? So like to the Yelp review point, like people leave a Yelp review when they're super mad about something, or they really like it. Nobody's like, oh, this was a cool place. Like, it was okay. And so, like, how for you has that, increased interaction with those fans? Has that put any burdens on you? Has that, created any conflicts with how you, go and interact with them in general?
Well, yeah, so the show is based around social activism. And so being on the show, and before the show, I became, I'll call it like a soft social activist. And then being on the show, I got way more aggressive with my activism. Yeah. And I think that the user feedback I would get and the comments and conversations I would have with people online were everything from people who would support my ideas and my ideals, and then people who hated and wanted to terrorize me. So I think that that kind of access is interesting from a creative perspective, because I'm so happy that these people feel seen and feel like someone is standing up for them. But then, like, also, am I putting myself in danger because these other people are you know, not wanting me to be a voice for the people. To answer your question, I think that it's just it's a complicated line that I have to kind of face, and I don't really I only get it from the people who are logging on to these social accounts. Like I'm not getting it from a data perspective. You know, I'm getting this like instant user feedback.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, kind of like, to be frank, like, you know, from Hollywood to Silicon Valley, like there are issues with representation and equity in that representation. And so for both of you, like how does your gender or racial identity play into your role, you know, respectively in technology and in entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few examples. Like founding a startup was really difficult as a woman of color, just one, being taken seriously, two, getting the kind of mentorship that other people more easily get. 3, talking to investors was often seen as dating investors, and that was really yucky. And you could tell I'm a mom when I use words like yucky. Wow.
No.
Exactly. And then now that I'm back in school, you know, when I'm in education spaces, when I'm in psychology spaces, it's a little more common to see a Black woman than when I'm in any of my data science or computer science classes, which those same issues pop up: lack of mentorship, lack of investment in me as a student, those kinds of things. But at the same time, it's not all bad, because I think that there's a really big opportunity for me to bring new ideas to the forefront, and then you end up kind of getting singled out as this voice. But there's privilege in that, and so I often think about, like, okay, what's the best way to use that? How do I not perpetuate issues of colorism by being the one of, like, you know, 2 light-skinned girls on a panel? Yeah. When there are Black women, you know, there's those kinds of things at play. Even though the representation is there, it's still fraught. So yeah.
Yeah. And then,
sorry, you know, I'd be listening. I'm just like, yes. No, I'm like, yeah. I lost your question because I was just listening, honestly.
Yeah, no, just talking about how, you know, being a woman, also being, you know, a woman of color, like how that has impacted you in the space of Hollywood, and do you see equity, you know, within Hollywood and things like that?
I definitely feel like I am one of the lucky few who I came out to LA when I was 14 with nothing under my belt, no experience, no anything. And I was able to find a manager and agent and started working within 3 months, and, you know, was on network television and on Nickelodeon and on Disney. And it was I was, as the Incomparables Zendaya loves to say, I was Hollywood's acceptable version of a Black woman. And so I found myself very easily, like, booking these roles, but at the same time, they were limited. You know, like, I found myself playing a bully all of the time. I found myself playing a villain all of the time. Like, or someone who's very frustrated and angry. Like, I didn't find myself just playing the cute, funny gal all the time. Right. The girl next door, as they say. When that's totally me.
Yeah.
So I think that as I've gotten to where I am now, I count my blessings, and what I want to do going forward is to use the doors that have been open for me to continue to hold the door open for the next generation and the next group of women who look like and don't look like me. Because I think that, you know, when we talk about our biases, like, a lot of times we're keen on the people who look like us, right? Like, you want to see those people win because it's our tribalism. It's very normal for us. But what about everyone else, right? Totally. So that's kind of what I want to continue to do.
I think that's a good point, because we talk about kind of like privilege, and, like, you know, like, privilege isn't just for white men, right? Like, sometimes when we're the ones, like, there might be one Black person in the room, but, like, you're in the room, right? So, like, is there times that you, like, have tried to use your privilege of being in the room for good in order to, like, make sure that, you know, you are holding the door open for, you know, people?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I go to, like, the whitest institution in the country, if not everywhere. And not white as in, like, lack of diverse representation among students, but just, like, the culture and what it was built on and everything. So yeah, I think it's really important, which is why my tech startup was trying to increase access to college counseling for youth of color. And you know, there's lots of work that you have to do and is a responsibility for you to do once you get access to spaces like this.
Right.
I was going to piggyback off of what Logan said. I think, you know, in terms of the democratization of media content creation, like I certainly felt that firsthand making music, because the only way I could be taken seriously as a musician, I felt, was to just build my own studio, make my own thing, figure out how to, you know, mix and master and do all that stuff so that I could release it and have complete control over the narrative. And, you know, that's like a common trope, a common path now for musicians. But I think we don't think enough about how all the media that we're flooded with, whether it's like all of the YouTube influencers and people that you work with, or the musicians that are on SoundCloud, things like that, that there are still these pipelines for how these people get access to audiences. And those pipelines are computational in nature. And so I think a lot about how biases in these algorithms may be pushing people away or toward certain content. And if they're context aware enough to understand that, you know, this is somebody who needs some like reaffirming content in terms of their racial identity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means mental health wise when we start talking about like youth and the role in youth. But it's cool that we have all this content, and it's not all on Netflix, which is also cool because even that's like a big studio kind of production thing now. But how do we direct people to that content in a reliable and responsible way?
So what is like the message to like technology companies or, you know, some of the platforms that are, you know, increasing this democratization? Like, how do they think about, like, go about like making sure that they don't have biases or like have processes in place to check that? Because like oftentimes AI, like to your point, like it mirrors what's in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. And so if like, because you're going and looking and finding patterns that happen in the real world and bias exists in the real world. So how do we go about, you know, making sure that we do something about it?
Not working in a company like this as an outsider, and I would love to hear from you guys like afterwards about this, but and how my own views might be flawed on this. But I think equity has to be a bottom line. Like it has to be really seriously considered at every level of production. And that means, you know, not just hiring more faces of color, like not just making sure you have a diversity and inclusion strategy, which is important, and also not just doing algorithmic audits, which is also important. We should understand like where the biases are, but also having people who think really deeply about this on every level of production. To make sure that, because we all have biases, so you know we all need to be thinking about, oh, you're right, that was that thing that I didn't catch, and that's going to make this a better product in the end. So yeah.
Yeah, and then so kind of on your side, Logan, like, you know, you talked about the access to data that creators have and creatives have, you know, from all these different platforms. How, you know, do you go about ensuring that, you know, you balance between like taking in that information, but also like being a creative and actually creating from like your place of, you know, wherever you want to create from?
Well, I mean, when it comes to telling stories, we all have them. So no one is denied their story, right, first and foremost. You know, whether you're in the majority or not, everyone's story does matter to me. And I just think it's balancing out and evening the playing field so that everyone's story gets to be told and heard. And for me, the way that happens is by looking at the history of who has had their stories told already multiple times and who hasn't. And so one of the things that I do is, you know, if I'm asked to come in for a specific role, and like there's one in particular I can think of, and it was originally an August Wilson play, and I looked it up, and I saw that the character, literally August Wilson's words say, "A dark-skinned woman walks into the room." But I was still being asked to come audition. And I appreciate the opportunity, right? Like I do appreciate being asked and given opportunity to be in these spaces, but I have to then formulate a very eloquent email to say why I won't. and not just that it's a no, but why it's a no, and then who they should be calling in. And so that's just kind of something that I have to do on my end in terms of creatives getting the data. A lot of times, the way that I get my data personally is listening to my contemporaries who haven't had the spotlight, listening to the people who haven't had their stories told. And so I'm aware, honestly, before I was on Dear White People, I wasn't really aware. I never really would have thought to do that. And then our creators on the show get, I believe they get a certain kind of editorial information about who's watching the show. Just Netflix, I don't believe, releases it.
To piggyback off of that, I think we also need to understand that equity and equality are two different things. And so it's not just about not doing harm by telling stories egregiously wrong or completely leaving people out, or making sure that you're not propagating white supremacist views or hate speech, but also how are we lifting up people who are part of marginalized communities. And we can do that in an efficient way if we really think about it from a tech perspective. There's that nuance between equity and equality that people really need to be thinking about as well.
It's actually been interesting to hear you, Logan, talk about how, as a biracial woman coming and being on Dear White People, has taught you things about race. Can you talk a little bit more about what you've learned by playing this character?
I briefly, because my story is very complicated, and my identity is very complicated. I'm actually not what you see, and I am what you see. So for me, being a biologically biracial woman who's raised by Black parents, who doesn't identify or didn't identify as biracial, who now realizes she does, but also just identifies as Black, but is now playing a character who is biracial but identifies as Black, and is, you know what I mean? It's
layers.
Fucking complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated.
The character's supposed to be complicated, not me, right? And so being on this show and dealing with, and not just biracial identity, but all of these different characters' identities and what the world, really it's about what the world puts on us versus how we see ourselves, and then where we have to meet it in the middle. If the world sees me as this, then I have to show up a certain way. Yep. I have to kind of knock down those blocks that have been put in front of me. I have to make you feel comfortable over here. I have to be really productive for my people over here. It's really complicated. Yeah. I think the thing that I've gotten out of it most is just understanding that it is going to be, for me and everyone else, an ongoing educational process, understanding our identities as they pertain to race specifically, because as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, racism is, race is the daughter of racism. Ta-Nehisi Coates says race is the daughter of racism. So we have to understand that first and foremost in order to really understand ourselves.
It's really important because, it is a diaspora, right? There are so many different experiences, so many different stories, and even you kind of explaining that, at the beginning, it's we kind of laugh, but it's complicated. There is a lot of layers to it, and you're like you said, telling stories is very important because your story is different than this person's, but now I can have your perspective because you told your story. So thank you for sharing. And so, oftentimes we see at technology companies, there's this kind of innate tension between creatives and business, or engineering and technology. What are some of the ways that these companies can go about mainstreaming and streamlining that communication and helping both of those sides work together towards common goals?
At the end of the day, this all comes down to human decision making, right? We really cannot believe in computational objectivity as the path forward, because it just doesn't exist. Our own biases, as I said before, are baked into the way we use technology, the way we build technology. And so the way to move forward is to, one, really understand that, and two, make sure that we're making human-to-human decisions that bring more of these diverse perspectives, more of these stories into the room, into every room where tech is being built, so that we're not overlooking these things. I feel like a little bit of a broken record, but, and I really think that this isn't an issue, this is more of an issue of like public health, right? Because the perspective I take on this is we already know that people who are in the process of building their racial identity or who have achieved a racial identity, which really means they've thought about it, they've kind of come to an idea about what it means for them. Those people fare better in terms of mental health, in terms of how their relationships go, in terms of their achievement. You know, for children, it's obviously school, and that's what I'm focused on, but achievement looks differently in spaces like this. And then that's just for people of color, right? So, and when they experience discrimination, being able to say, oh, that's not about me as an individual, and kind of separate themselves, because I now have this knowledge that this is all fake, because race is a social construct. It impacts my life in really real ways, but the ideas behind it are all fake and fairy tale. And so for white people, which I think people really overlook, this is a mental health issue as well. So racial and ethnic identity development research shows us that white folks who have come to like a privileged, cognizant way of thinking about whiteness not only appreciate diversity more, but they also fare better on all these things, right? Mental health, relationships, achievement. And so this is definitely an area for interest convergence, where if we want to make sure the world is a healthier place, and then think about how are we making sure that people who are using our products are healthy, and as healthy as they could be by virtue of using the products.
You kind of talked about like achieving racial identity, right? I think that's very fascinating. Like, can you talk a little bit more about that and like, you know, what that process looks like, you know, from a research perspective maybe, and also like, you know, have you thought about that as well? Achieving
racial identity in psychological terms, I think of it a little bit as like the grieving process. You know how there are like these multiple steps of like, first there's like avoidance, or like, I don't want to think about this, and then like the world kind of breaks for you and you feel like the deep grief, and eventually you kind of come to this place of understanding and like acceptance. And so that's definitely what it was like for me. I had a very colorblind, in terms of my, not in terms of my understanding of myself as a racialized person, but in terms of like, how does race cause different people to achieve different things. I had a very colorblind approach to understanding that, and definitely believed in this like myth of meritocracy, that it's just about how hard you work and you got to overcome these things. And then I went to college, as most people of color as most people of color do. I got radicalized in college. And that just really means that I read a lot of Freire and a lot of Du Bois and stuff. So you guys are nodding because it happened to you too, I know. And there was a lot of pain there, like so much pain. Because it's like, how was I not taught this earlier? Like, I wish I had these tools when I was younger and dealing with all of this tumult when I was an adolescent. And then you come to a place of like, oh, well, that means there's an opportunity for me to do something about it. And so that's kind of the acceptance and path forward kind of piece. And so, but that looks really different depending on the context that you're in, right? So that sounds about right for what we see like generally for Black people, but it's completely different for people who are first generation Americans or people who are like DACA status. Very different for Native American folks, people who are in all racial enclaves versus being in really diverse environments. So, the thing we really don't know in terms of research, we don't know a lot about, is white racial identity development. Because white identity is the norm, so why should we go and inspect that? That's probably kind of the thinking behind that. But there are a lot of people now, thankfully, contemporary researchers who are starting to look at that. There's just like such a gap in the literature around that. So.
That's such an interesting thing to think about, that research behind developing white identity, or like when you realize, that's so interesting. In terms of achieving that identity, I think about I'm rereading Their Eyes Were Watching God. And in the very beginning, Zora's main character, when she's very, very young, Zora Neale Hurston's main character is her family lives with a white family. They live in a house in the same yard as this white family that her grandma works with, and she plays with, the white family's grandkids, etc. She never thinks of herself as any different. And one day, a man walks up and he asks to take their picture. He gets the picture developed. He brings it back to them. They're all looking at the picture, and she doesn't see herself. She's like, wait, where am I? And they're like, that's you. She's like, she looks at her dress and she's like, or she looks at the dress in the picture. She's like, wait, that is my dress. Oh, I'm colored. Like that was her, literally was what the character says. Yeah. And so it was in that moment that she realized that she was different from them. And then, from that point on, that person is going to develop their identity based on that separation. So I think about me, for example, and in my house, if I think about the art that was on the walls, like it was all very, very dark-skinned, beautiful art. Actually, I thought back and I'm like, yeah, there were no like light-skinned people on my walls. And so my identity was, obviously like I can see myself in the mirror, but like that is what I identified with. So as I continue to grow up and people would say like, you're either not Black or you're biracial, I'd be like, but the writing's on the wall. Right. This picture is me, and this is what I am. So my personal identity, it has a lot to do with, or is influenced a lot by art, which I think is why we're here, to talk about all of these different creations, whether they're paper or paint or picture in a moving box or that moves in a box. It's like it affects that identity that we're creating. Mm-hmm. Always. Yeah, that, and also the social interactions we're having around that content. So I mean, and if that's not what YouTube does, then like, what do you guys do? Like that's exactly what's going on here. And so you have to see platforms as mechanisms for racial and ethnic identity development. Yeah.
I think that's really cool because I think that is what has changed, the way the world is viewed, right? Like we can see, there's like, I talk about like, I really love what I do is because like I help enable the democratization of media. And sometimes it's about race and sometimes it's about gender, but sometimes it's just like the weird girl who like, there's other people, like 8 million other weird people who are like, now I have a community, right? And you can have, the ability to, somewhat feel normal, especially as you're growing up, right? And I think that that's something that's super important, for youth. I know you all both have some thoughts on like, how important, the democratization of media and media in general is for youth. And can you just talk a little bit more about, that? Yeah, for sure. So I think about why it's important to understand the difference between adults and youth because of two things. One is their psychology is just more in flux than ours is. Their brains are still developing. They're actively asking these questions because they're trying to form some kind of identity. And then the second reason is because they're telling us the future, right? So people who know nothing other than having an iPhone and instant access to content, which I had like an AOL account when I was 8, but like that's completely different. Like AIM screen name?
Right, exactly. I don't remember what it was. Avi QT 98, because that's the year that I made it.
Mine was Dream Eyes 007.
Nice.
That's the year I was going to graduate high school. Oh, I just told on myself.
Anyway, we have this really cool opportunity to do like quasi-experiments because we have two groups of people who have, for lack of a better words, been exposed to life without the internet, and then another group of people who have not been exposed to life without the internet. And so as a researcher, like that's a really important thing to be able to understand like what are some of the conclusions we can draw about use of technology by comparing youth and adults. And also, as a researcher, it's really interesting to think about how we have like a lifespan of data because they're digital natives. Yeah. I think like we also don't know because youth identity is just much more in flux and psychology is much more in flux. We don't know how algorithmic bias or some of these things that can do harm affect these groups more vulnerable groups in different ways. And some of the research that I've been working on lately suggests that they do. They have very different effects on young people versus adults. And some of that is because of the psychology, and another part of that is because of the technological savvy that they have. Like, you know, older people, we all know this, they get on Facebook and they share all the misinformation. And they do that more than young people do because young people have grown up with this tech literacy. But that's not to say that when they're interacting with that content, it's not shaping their psychology in a way that may have unintended consequences.
When you think about, you know, for you, you know, like, are there certain, you know, stories that you think need to be told, or, you know, do you think that you've seen the impact of stories like, you know, Dear White People, for example, on younger people and how they've, you know, developed?
I think kind of what, to Avriel's point, that she's expressed to me in here today is we don't know yet, and so that's why the research is necessary. And I mean, from what I can gather in this, I guess, 4 years-ish that we've done Dear White People is, I mean, I think about our characters played by, well, I'll say the character names, Joelle, Kelsey, Coco, our darker skinned actresses, and how, as, you know, the show really began with Sam White, my character, in the very middle. And there were a group of people who related to Sam White. Avriel has confessed as one, who got to see themselves, right? And so then after that season 1, where you really got to where everyone got to know Sam White, and you don't have to look like Sam White to get to know her. I think that was the whole point of Dear White People. You don't have to look like any of these characters to understand them, but the people who do look like them get to see themselves. And so once the Sam Whites of the world got to see themselves, it's really important to make sure that everyone else gets that chance as well, not just in brief interactions with really interesting story. And so the fun part about our show is because it's told in a multi-protagonist way, in a multi-protagonist format, every character gets a chance to be at the center of their own story, and not just the best friend, not just the villainess. And so I have gotten to see that immediate user feedback of people being so emotionally grateful for finally seeing themselves in strong Black women who, you know, are super smart, are super loyal, are super compassionate, are super all of the things, like super right, super wrong. Our stories really weren't always told that way. In the 90s in sitcoms, yeah, like, you know, Sister Sister, Moesha, shows Fresh Prince, you know, those shows, we got to see ourselves a little bit, but then they went away. So it's also about making sure that these stories are told ongoing, not like, checked, okay, we have an Asian American lead in To All the Boys I Loved Before, check, okay, we have a special needs actor, check. Like, no, these stories should be constantly told. And you can do a search on anything and see that people want that. Once you see those characters expressed on a screen, you can see that the people are so happy that they're finally getting a chance to see themselves.
And that's what's so cool about like targeted marketing of these of this content and personalization. Like, I think I told you about this joke on Big Mouth where like one of the characters is really struggling with his sexual identity, and he's like, they made a show just about me as a magician who's struggling with his sexual identity, and like it showed up on my homepage. And so that's like literally how it happens though. Like I knew Logan before Dear White People came out, or around the same time Dear White People came out, and like, it was literally the first thing on my homepage, and they were like, you're gonna like this.
You're gonna really like this.
You're gonna like being seen as like an activist on an Ivy League campus. And I'm like, yeah, nope, this is a show made exactly about my life. And the cool thing about YouTube is like, that stuff is I mean, that it's just so plentiful. Like every niche you could possibly want, you can find. Even the niches you don't want, you can find. And so, you know, recommendation needs to happen in that model, I think, but then there also needs to be a balance of like, okay, this is reaffirming, but how do I get exposed to new ideas and like new stories that I haven't been exposed to that are not only gonna make me understand the world and appreciate diversity, but also help me understand myself in relation to different types of people.
Yeah.
I think to your point, I was at a holiday party with Netflix, and I was talking to a producer from not from Netflix. He was an independent producer, and he was at the party, and he and his wife came over, and they were like, "Hey, remember you had a general with us? Like, we love the show so much, but it's so crazy, like." I feel like we always go up to people and we're like, have you heard of Dear White People? It's like one of the best shows on Netflix. And they're like, no, never heard of it. And it's like, wow, this is definitely something that people who don't just look like the people on Dear White People should be watching.
Right.
Because it's kind of like also the point.
Yeah, that's a good message about understanding that it is important that we're creating a lot of content that is targeted towards people, but also like you don't want to live in your own echo chamber where you're only being recommended, only seeing things that are already related to what you know. Like, oh yeah, we know you'll like this because you've watched this already, right? Like, of course, but like you need to have exposure to things that are outside of that as well.
Yeah.
I think we're going to open it up to a couple of questions from the audience right now. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, just there's mics on the side, and you can just go ahead and walk on up.
Hey, just want to first thank you both for coming to Google and speaking about this. Really appreciate your honest perspective and taking the time. I actually work in video advertising with media entertainment clients, actually with Netflix in particular. And the issue I'm facing in creating equity is the concept of the demo or demographic that a lot of media agencies and media companies like still rely on. And I don't blame them because like media is really expensive to run, especially like in these kind of short periods of time. And I think Dear White People is like one of the best examples of showing, like in particular with the Black identity, how it's not a monolith, right? Like you have so many different people identifying so many different ways. So like my YouTube will look very different than your YouTube, et cetera. And so I'm thinking about what types of research can we show to media buyers and just media, the whole media industry, to kind of show how fragmented an identity is, because a lot of times they're like, oh, we have a Black show with a Black cast, so Black demo, rather than saying like, hey, this show is about, like Dear White People, about, academic equity, whatever, and that actually applies to a lot of different, facial demographics, what have you. So how do we kind of change that narrative, with research, and then how do we use shows like Dear White People to educate people in a more simpler way, to kind of tell that new narrative?
I think a lot of that really needs to start on like a qualitative research side where human beings are talking to other human beings about how they use social media and how, not just how they use social media, but how it influences their identity development. As far as I'm aware, that research doesn't exist. Maybe it happens internally at some of these places, but it definitely doesn't get released out into the academic world. And then I think there's also a lot of work on like the computer science side around how do we classify media that is racial identity related or adjacent, and how do we make sure that those classification models are also context aware, because different racial identity related content is going to hit different people at different points of their lives and in different ways. And so those are the two things that I'm thinking about right now as far as like what my future research agenda is. But yeah, you maybe from a creator standpoint, like what you'd want to do with that data.
It makes me think of something that we kind of talked about outside of today, which was like the benevolence aspect, and just thinking about. I'll use myself as an example. So I did a film called The Perfection that some people see as really feminist and some people see as like very detrimental to the Black female lead. Like I can see both. And so in doing that, like if you were to poll like a room full of people or poll whatever, how it affected them, what would you, I guess I'm posing a question back. Like, what would we do with it in terms of like, was this particular content beneficial to a large enough group of people? Was it detrimental to a large enough group of people? Because for me, the reason I took that role was because I'd never seen a person who looks like me play a wild character like that. And it wasn't written as a Black woman on page, and we did a lot of work to make sure that it wasn't a white savior story. So I would be very curious as a creative to know, what those actual numbers are, because I can see all I have to go off of are hashtags.
There is like a research model that's already happened, and it was specifically on YouTube. So they were looking at like, how do people get radicalized by white supremacy or like alt-right content on YouTube? I don't know how many of you guys know about this study, but so basically they looked at like the Up Next feature and over like millions and millions of videos, quantifying like what was being shown next. But then they were also tracking users who were commenting on these videos and understanding kind of the timeline of what they watched and then how their comments evolved over time. And so not only did the videos get more and more extreme, there was definitely a pipeline, but the users reacted differently and their views became more and more extreme. And so obviously you can't like take causality, like understand causality in that approach. But I think that speaks to like an efficient way that people who have access to data in spaces like these can understand more nuance and more complexity than more efficient than what Logan can do by like looking at hashtags. And then that information can be shared with creators so they know what to do with it. In the same way that you can be pulled into the extreme of a really dark place, I believe you could be pulled into a really positive and healthy place as well. And people need to understand if that's even happening, because I don't know, I don't think any of you guys know if that's happening, but.
Yeah, I mean, and for me, the only other thing that I really have outside of hashtags is like, in my activism, I'll do work where someone from a particular organization will make a in-person connection with me, and I'll have their contact information. So say I was gonna create a story about a specific community, like there are resources that you can call and ask, like, hey, how do I properly tell the story of X? But even so, like you've already brought up, that group is not monolithic. So how many stories are in that subcategory?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Echoing his thanks, Avriel and Logan, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I have little cousins. I hope to have children someday. I understand there's bias. What do you teach your kids based off what you know about how they interact with YouTube or Instagram, other platforms? What do you teach your children someday about, based off the feedback you've had from the instant feedback? What do you teach them? How do you guide them? What are the do's and the don'ts?
Yeah, my husband and I argue about this all the time. Okay. He's in the camp of like no screens, and he's also a Luddite, so like that explains his response. Self-professed. I'm not dissing him on camera. And I'm of the opinion of children need to understand how screens work. They need to be able to not only navigate technology, but also learn how to manipulate technology in ways that serve them. But as an adult and as a mom, I feel like the most important thing is to make sure that I'm there while my child is interacting with any kind of content, at least up until the point where I don't have control over that anymore, which sometime in adolescence probably that will happen. So that I can kind of relay, okay, this is how I make sense of this. This is what this is telling me. What is it telling you? Like, what do you think about this story? Is there anything wrong with the story? Is there something that's really great about it? And just like really have conversations around the media that they're interacting with. Yeah. Ask me in 5 more years, I might have a different answer.
I guess the thing I think about is, because I don't have children yet, I think about my parents and what I was exposed to. And I was exposed to a lot of live media, like a lot of like plays and jazz. And so all of my my personal identity and my understanding of culture and everything began to develop in a personal relationship. So then I sought those specific things digitally. once I had a PC, you know, like my dad was like, hey, and I think that my parents were very specific in the content that they offered us. You know, we got to go to the store and pick out some things we wanted, say like the CD-ROMs we wanted, and but ultimately my dad was like, you're gonna get Mavis Beacon teaches typing 9. Like you're getting the black woman teaching you how to type. And like, so those were, did anybody else have that?
Yeah, we definitely had that. Like A, E, O.
But, right. It was great. But also I got Sims. So because I wanted Sims. And I think that that's what I know my parents did to kind of balance out that. And I guess in thinking about going forward, I have 3 nephews and a niece, and I ask them honest questions because they all have social media accounts, and so I try not to judge the things that they put out. When sometimes like I do that emoji, I'm like, oh my God, why would you say that? Why would you? But you know, they're in a different space and time, and so I'm in the position where I'm asking them the questions because I'm curious about how they're being affected. I mean, I think about, you know, the necessary gun reform and how they're being affected by seeing all these school shootings, and yeah, so my answer is I'm asking the questions.
Yeah, and to just go back to my original point of why cultivating a strong identity or an identity that you've thought about is so important, it's because when you start seeing discrimination vicariously or violence vicariously through social media, you need that buffer, and having a very strong understanding of who you are and where you are in society provides that buffer. So if nothing else, kids should be given the opportunity to really explore their identities in structured ways with adults who are equipped to guide them through that process.
Let's thank both of them for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you.
I learned a lot, you know, and I hope you all did too. And yeah, we're out.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.